Mary Thompson adjusted her scrubs as she entered room 312, the faint hum of medical equipment filling the sterile air. The space was cold, both in temperature and atmosphere, illuminated by the pale glow of fluorescent lights. The scent of antiseptic was ever present, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. In the center of the room lay William "Bill" Carter, unmoving yet surrounded by the hum of monitors that confirmed he was still tethered to existence. Bill's reputation preceded him, a man of immense wealth, known for his sharp business acumen and reclusive nature, now reduced to this silent state. Mary had heard the details from others, the accident, the months of care, the whispers about the family tensions. But beyond the gossip, the man in the bed remained a mystery. As Mary went about her duties, her movements were quick and practiced. She checked the 4 lines, adjusted the monitors, and made notes in his chart. Her life outside these walls felt as precarious as the patient's delicate condition. Bills piled high, rent overdue, and shifts that blurred one into the next. This job, however grueling, was her only option. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said softly, not expecting a response. She had made it a habit to speak to him, as though her voice might bridge the gap between consciousness and silence. "The sun's out today, though I'm not sure you'd know it in here." Her eyes lingered on his face, calm yet unnervingly still. She was about to turn away when something caught her attention, a faint twitch in his fingers. She paused, unsure if she'd imagined it, but then it happened again. The movement was deliberate, small but intentional. Her pulse quickened. Could it have been a reflex? She leaned in, focusing intently on his hand. The tapping repeated, steady and rhythmic. Tap, pause, tap tap, pause. It was too structured to dismiss. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low and careful. She reached out, lightly brushing her fingers against his. The tapping stopped. The stillness that followed felt heavier, as though the room itself held its breath. Mary's thoughts raced, questions forming faster than she could process them. What was he trying to say? And why now, after all this time? She didn't know, but she resolved to find out. Mary entered room 312 the following morning, her thoughts still lingering on the rhythmic movements she had observed the day before. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone yet, not even Janet, her closest colleague. Something about it felt too fragile, too important to share prematurely. Her routine was interrupted when she found 2 unfamiliar figures already in the room. The first was a sharply dressed man with graying hair, standing rigidly by Bill's bedside. His dark suit and polished demeanor exuded authority. The other was a woman, elegant yet detached, leaning against the window with an air of disinterest. Her features bore a faint resemblance to Bill's. "You must be the nurse," the man said curtly, glancing at her badge. "David Harris, Mr. Carter's legal counsel." "And I'm Sophia," the woman interjected, her tone as cold as the room itself. "His sister." Mary nodded politely, stepping aside to give them space. Despite their attempts at formality, tension rippled through their interaction. David's clipped remarks clashed with Sophia's aloof responses, revealing an underlying strain. "I trust you're maintaining Mr. Carter's care adequately?" David asked, his tone carrying a thinly veiled condescension. "Of course," Mary replied, keeping her voice steady. "He's stable, and we're monitoring his progress closely." Sophia crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on her brother. "Progress," she murmured, her voice tinged with bitterness. "That's an optimistic word, considering the circumstances." David's sharp look silenced her, but the unspoken animosity between them lingered. Mary couldn't help but wonder what kind of relationship they had before Bill's coma, and what secrets might be buried beneath their polite facades. As they continued their muted conversation, Mary turned her attention back to Bill. She adjusted the monitors, her movements deliberate as she observed his hand. Then she saw it again. The faint, deliberate tapping. Tap, pause, tap tap, pause. Her breath hitched. She glanced at David and Sophia, who seemed oblivious to the motion. Her heart raced as she tried to piece together the pattern. It wasn't random, it was trying to say something. Later that day, during a quiet moment, Mary sat by Bill's bedside. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, she began to speak softly about her own life. her childhood in foster care, the loneliness she'd carried for so long. As she spoke, she swore the tapping grew more deliberate, as if in acknowledgement. She was no longer alone in her discovery. Bill, in his silent way, was trying to communicate, and Mary was determined to listen. Mary stood by the hospital window during her break, staring at the bustling world outside. The hum of distant conversations and the faint beeping of monitors provided a steady rhythm to her thoughts. Yet, her mind wasn't on the present. It wandered to the past, to the foster homes where she had spent her childhood. She could still recall the cold, impersonal walls of the group homes, the uncertainty of never knowing where she would end up next. Yet amidst the hardships, there were moments that had shaped her, like the kindness of a social worker who had believed in her potential and encouraged her to pursue nursing. That belief was what kept her going now, even as she struggled to keep her own life afloat. Returning to room 312 after her break, Mary found Janet tidying up. Janet was an older nurse, seasoned but kind, always ready to offer advice or a listening ear. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mr. Carter," Janet remarked, her tone more curious than critical. Mary hesitated before answering. "He's different. There's something about him. It's hard to explain." Janet chuckled softly, pausing to lean against the counter. "Well, if the rumors are true, he wasn't always the cold businessman people think he is. Did you know he used to fund shelters and community programs? Quietly, of course. He didn't want the publicity." Mary looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Oh, yes," Janet said, her voice softening. "A lot of those shelters wouldn't have made it without his donations. One of them even took in kids from foster care." Mary's chest tightened at the mention of foster care, a quiet connection forming in her mind. She hadn't expected this side of Bill. Philanthropy didn't fit the image of the distant figure she'd imagined. That evening, while sitting by Bill's bed, Mary found herself talking to him again. "I didn't know you helped people like me," she murmured. "Maybe we're not so different, you and I." As she spoke, the faint tapping began again. Tap, pause, tap tap, pause. Mary froze, the rhythm seeping into her consciousness like a riddle begging to be solved. She focused intently, counting the beats and noting the intervals. "Danger," she whispered to herself, her heart pounding as realization dawned. The pattern wasn't random. It was a warning. Bill was trying to tell her something crucial, and she had to figure it out before it was too late. Mary adjusted her stance as she faced Sophia Carter in the quiet lounge near Bill's room. The tension between them was palpable. Sophia sat with one leg crossed over the other, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the arm of the chair. Mary hesitated before speaking, choosing her words carefully. "Miss Carter," Mary began, her tone firm but measured, "I couldn't help but notice there's a strain in your visits with Mr. Carter. Forgive me if this is out of line, but is there something I should know? Something that could help in his care?" Sophia's icy demeanor didn't falter. Her lips curved into a tight, humorless smile. "His care is the hospital's responsibility, isn't it? I'm sure you're doing your best." Sophia's avoidance only sharpened Mary's resolve. "Of course, but it's obvious there's more going on here. I can sense it." For a moment, Sophia's expression softened. Something flickered in her eyes. Was it regret? Guilt? Before Mary could discern, Sophia leaned forward. "You're new here, nurse. Let me give you some advice. Don't dig too deep into Carter family matters. You won't like what you find." Her tone was low and clipped, dismissive yet undeniably ominous. Sophia rose and left without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Mary's unease grew. There was something more to this family's story, something she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, Mary received a surprising visitor in the staff break room. Alex Mitchell, an old friend from her foster care days. His warm smile and disheveled appearance were a welcome contrast to the rigid world of the hospital. After catching up briefly, Mary hesitantly mentioned Bill's strange tapping patterns and her suspicions. Alex's brows knitted in thought. "That's definitely unusual. If he's trying to communicate, it could mean he's more aware than the doctors think. I can help you figure it out." With Alex's tech expertise, they began reviewing Bill's records. It didn't take long for him to find something odd. "Mary, look at this," Alex said, pointing to the screen of his laptop. "There's a gap in the data, like someone tampered with his records. Medications, vitals. It doesn't add up." Mary's heart raced. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone wanted Bill silenced, and now she had proof that something wasn't right. The warning he had been trying to give her wasn't just urgent, it was life-threatening. The revelation from Alex's findings weighed heavily on Mary's mind as she returned to room 312. Each step felt heavier, the implications of what she'd uncovered gnawing at her resolve. She glanced at Bill's unmoving form, her chest tightening. What had he been caught up in? And why would someone go to such lengths to keep him silent? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp click of polished shoes behind her. Turning, she saw David Harris entering the room, his expression as unreadable as ever. His presence was a cold reminder of the tension that had been brewing since their first meeting. "Nurse Thompson," he greeted, his tone polite yet edged. "I wanted to check in on Mr. Carter's care." Mary nodded, wary of his sudden interest. "He's stable, though there haven't been any significant changes." David stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the monitors before shifting to her. "That's good to hear. You've been quite dedicated to him, haven't you? Spending a lot of extra time here." The comment hung in the air, more accusation than observation. Mary held his gaze, unwilling to be intimidated. "I treat all my patients with care." "Of course," David replied smoothly, his lips curving into a thin smile. "Just a friendly reminder, Nurse Thompson. Some things are better left alone. Focus on your duties. It's what's best for everyone." With that, he left, his presence leaving an icy trail. Mary's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. There was no mistaking the warning in his words. Her instinct told her to back off, but something stronger. The faint tapping messages, the altered records, the unspoken secrets, pushed her forward. Later, as Mary adjusted Bill's bedding, her fingers brushed against something stiff beneath the mattress. Frowning, she carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it, revealing handwriting in sharp, hurried strokes. The letter was brief but damning. It mentioned a deal gone wrong and a veiled reference to settling scores. At the bottom, it bore the signature of someone with the initials DH. Mary's stomach dropped. "David Harris." The words echoed in her mind as she folded the letter back. This wasn't just about greed. It was personal, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Bill's accident had been no accident at all. As Mary looked back at Bill's still face, a wave of determination surged through her. Whatever the risks, she couldn't walk away now. Bill's silent warnings demanded action, and she was the only one willing to listen. Mary sat across from Alex in his small, cluttered apartment, papers and files spread across the coffee table between them. The air was thick with tension as they sifted through the documents Mary had secretly collected, including the damning letter she'd found in Bill's room. Alex, ever the tech-savvy problem solver, was intently typing on his laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These numbers don't add up," Alex muttered, pointing to a financial statement on his screen. "Look here. Funds were funneled out of Carter Industries into shell companies, but the timing is odd. This started right after Bill's accident." Mary leaned closer, her eyes scanning the lines of data. "So someone's been profiting while he's been incapacitated. But who?" Alex's lips pressed into a thin line. "The shell companies are hard to trace, but whoever's behind this had access to his accounts and legal authority. It's someone close." Mary's stomach churned. "David," she whispered, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "He has the motive, and he's been hovering around like a vulture." Alex nodded. "It's likely, but we'll need more than speculation to prove it. Let me dig deeper." Returning to the hospital that evening, Mary found Janet tidying up near the nurse's station. Normally warm and approachable, Janet's demeanor felt off. She avoided Mary's gaze and seemed unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" Mary asked, trying to sound casual. "Fine," Janet replied quickly, her tone clipped. "Just a long day." Mary's instincts told her something was wrong. Janet had always been supportive, but now there was an odd tension between them. As Janet walked away, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Later, Alex called. his voice crackling with urgency over the phone. "Mary, I found something. There's a file buried deep in the Carter Industries server. It's encrypted, but the metadata suggests it's medical. It might explain why Bill's in that coma." Mary's breath hitched. "Can you access it?" "I'll need time, but yes. If this file is what I think it is, it could blow the whole thing wide open." Hanging up, Mary sat in the quiet of her apartment, her mind racing. With each new discovery, the stakes grew higher. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, but she was getting closer. The question was whether she could expose it before they silenced her too. The early morning light streamed through the blinds in room 312, casting soft, broken patterns over the still figure of Bill Carter. Mary sat beside him, her usual professional demeanor replaced with quiet reflection. The discoveries of the past few days weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't shake the growing bond she felt with the man lying before her. She adjusted his blanket, her movements tender, as though the small gesture might convey the words she couldn't say aloud. Bill's silent presence had become more than just a responsibility. It had become a source of unexpected comfort. "Do you know, Bill?" she began, her voice low and hesitant. "When I was little, I used to think the world was like a maze. Each turn felt like another dead end, another place where I didn't belong." Her fingers brushed his as she spoke, her heart pounding as if he might somehow respond. "But I learned something, eventually. There are people out there who care, even if it doesn't feel like it. People who see you when you think you're invisible." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I found out about the shelters you funded, the families you helped. That wasn't in the tabloids. They only cared about your money and your power. But you cared about people like me, people who didn't have anyone." Her voice caught, and she laughed softly, shaking her head. "And now here I am, trying to save you. Funny how life works, isn't it?" The room remained still, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Yet Mary felt an unspoken connection, as though Bill's silence held a depth she couldn't fully understand. It was a vulnerable moment, one she hadn't allowed herself in years. Later that day, Janet found her in the break room, her expression anxious. "Mary, I overheard David talking to the hospital administrator. He's asking questions about your shifts and why you're spending so much time with Mr. Carter." Mary's chest tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Enough to make people nervous," Janet replied, her voice dropping. "Be careful. He's watching you." As Mary walked back to room 312, a sharp sense of unease gripped her. David wasn't just suspicious. He was escalating. The threats were no longer implied. He was testing her boundaries, and the more she uncovered, the more she realized how far he might go to protect his secrets. That night, as she sat once more by Bill's bedside, she whispered softly, "Whatever happens, I won't stop. I can't. I just hope you're with me in this, somehow." Mary sat beside Alex in his dimly lit apartment, the screen of his laptop casting a pale glow across his focused face. Her pulse quickened as Alex's fingers danced over the keyboard, lines of code scrolling rapidly. Every keystroke felt like a step closer to an unsettling truth, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "There," Alex muttered, leaning back slightly. "I'm in." Mary leaned forward, her breath hitching as a series of medical records filled the screen. They weren't part of the standard hospital files she had access to. These were private, hidden deep within encrypted folders. Alex navigated carefully, pulling up detailed logs of Bill's treatment immediately following his accident. "This doesn't make sense," Mary said, her brow furrowing as she scanned the files. "The medications listed here, some of these weren't part of his official regimen." Alex nodded grimly. "Look at this one," he said, highlighting a specific entry. "This drug, administered in a high enough dose, it's used to induce a coma. But there's no legitimate reason it should have been given to him." Mary felt a cold chill run through her. "You're saying someone put him in this state on purpose?" "Looks that way," Alex confirmed. "The dosage, the timing. It wasn't an accident." Mary sat back, her thoughts spinning. Who would do this? And why? The answer came quickly, almost too easily. David. His calculated demeanor, his constant presence. He had both the motive and the access. Before Mary could voice her fears, Alex turned to her. We need to be careful. Whoever hid this went to a lot of trouble. If they find out we've seen it. His warning was cut short by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was Janet. Mary hesitated before answering, her voice cautious. Janet? What's wrong? I need to talk to you, Janet said, her voice trembling. It's about David. I've been keeping things from you. Mary met her at a quiet corner of the hospital later that evening. Janet's hands shook as she spoke, her words coming in hurried bursts. David's been pressuring me. He wanted me to watch you, report back on what you're doing. I didn't know why at first, but then he started threatening me. Why are you telling me now? Mary asked, though her tone was soft, without accusation. Because I can't do it anymore, Janet admitted. He's dangerous, Mary, and I think you're onto something bigger than either of us realized. Janet's confession only deepened Mary's resolve. With a hushed thank you, she returned to room 312 later that night, her mind racing with the weight of what she'd learned. As she adjusted Bill's bedding, her hand brushed against something solid beneath the frame. Frowning, she crouched down and found a small, locked safe, discreetly tucked away. Her heart raced as she ran her fingers over its surface. Whatever was inside, it had been hidden for a reason. Now, more than ever, she was determined to uncover the truth. But with David circling closer, every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a dangerous game. She needed answers, and fast. Mary stared at the small safe, her heart hammering as she weighed her options. The hospital was quiet, the late hour giving her a fleeting sense of security. With Alex's help earlier, she had managed to pick the lock. Now, the safe creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside was a stack of documents, neatly arranged but clearly concealed with care. Mary carefully pulled them out, her breath catching as she scanned the first few pages. Bank statements, wire transfers, and contracts, evidence of a web of financial fraud orchestrated through Carter Industries. The names of shell companies matched what Alex had discovered earlier, all tied back to David Harris. Flipping through the pages, Mary found more damning details. Email correspondences between David and other executives, thinly veiled discussions of funneling funds into offshore accounts. But it was the final document that made her stomach drop, a memo discussing Bill's unexpected incapacitation. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear. David hadn't just exploited Bill's condition, he had ensured it. Mary's hands trembled as she stuffed the papers back into the safe, her mind racing. She needed to act fast, but the realization that David was capable of this level of betrayal sent a chill through her. The next day, Mary approached Sophia, unable to shake the lingering question that had haunted her since discovering the memo. She found her in the hospital lounge, sipping coffee with a detached air. Sophia, Mary began, her tone hesitant but firm. I need to talk to you about your brother's condition. Sophia raised an eyebrow, setting her cup down. What about it? Mary hesitated, then pushed forward. I've found evidence that suggests his condition wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately put him in that coma. Sophia's face froze, her carefully crafted exterior cracking for just a moment. That's a serious accusation, she said quietly. Mary leaned closer, her voice low. You knew, didn't you? Maybe not everything, but you suspected something. That's why you've been avoiding David. Sophia's lips parted, but no words came out. After a moment, she sighed, rubbing her temples. I didn't know, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. But I had doubts. There were inconsistencies. I overheard things, conversations between David and some of Bill's associates, but I didn't know what to do. If I'd said something, You hesitated, Mary interrupted, her tone sharp. You hesitated while your brother's life was being stolen from him. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, her composure slipping further. I was scared, Mary. David doesn't just play games. He destroys people. If I'd confronted him without proof, I'd have been next. Mary's frustration flared, but she couldn't ignore the fear in Sophia's voice. It was clear that David's grip extended far beyond Bill's business. Taking a deep breath, Mary softened her tone. I understand you were afraid, but now we have the proof. Are you willing to help me stop him? Sophia nodded slowly, her expression conflicted but resolute. Yes, for Bill, I'll do whatever it takes. Mary's chest tightened. Trusting Sophia was a risk, but it was one she had to take. With David closing in and Bill's life hanging in the balance, there was no room for hesitation anymore. Mary leaned against the cold wall of the hospital's corridor, her mind racing with everything Sophia had confessed. She couldn't shake the image of her, broken and tearful, recounting the ways David had manipulated and coerced her into silence. The admission had left Mary reeling, torn between anger and understanding. She returned to room 312, her steps slow and heavy. Bill lay as he always did, silent and unmoving, but his presence had become a strange source of solace. She pulled a chair close to his bed, her hands trembling as she sat. "Bill," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady beeping of the machines. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know I'm fighting for you. I know you do the same for me." Her eyes brimmed with tears as she let her guard down, allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability. "You've been through so much, and now I'm finding out just how deep this goes. David, Sophia, they've all played a part in this nightmare. But I believe in you. I believe you're still fighting." Reaching out, she gently took his hand in hers, the warmth of his skin grounding her. "I can feel it," she murmured. "You're not giving up, and neither will I." The room fell silent save for the rhythmic hum of the machines. For a moment, Mary allowed herself to imagine Bill waking, his voice breaking the silence, telling her she wasn't alone in this battle. The thought brought a small, fleeting smile to her lips, but it faded as reality settled back in. The next day, Mary's fragile sense of hope was shattered when she overheard a heated conversation in the administrative office. David's voice, smooth yet insistent, carried through the partially open door. "I've made the arrangements," he said. "Carter's condition is stable enough to be transferred. A private facility will provide the specialized care he needs." Mary's stomach churned. Specialized care? She knew this wasn't about Bill's health, it was about control. If David moved him, she'd lose access to him and any chance of uncovering the truth. Her heart raced as she realized the stakes had just been raised. Before leaving the hospital that evening, Mary confided in Alex about what she'd overheard. His response was immediate and firm. "We need to stop this, Mary. If he's moved, we lose everything." Mary nodded, determination hardening her features. "I won't let that happen. Not while I still have a chance to fight for him." As she walked back to her car, her mind churned with plans and possibilities. David's move had forced her hand, but she wouldn't back down. Bill's life, and the truth, depended on her now more than ever. Mary sat across from Sophia in the small, dimly lit cafe near the hospital. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a quiet determination in Sophia's eyes that hadn't been there before. On the table between them lay a folder, thin but heavy with significance. "This," Sophia began, her voice low but steady, "is everything I have on David. It's not much, but it proves he's been diverting funds from Carter Industries into those shell companies. He thought I wasn't paying attention, but I've been keeping track for months." Mary carefully opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. Bank transfers, email threads, and even an internal memo with David's name prominently featured. "This is enough to expose him," she said, her voice tinged with hope. Sophia nodded. "But it's not without risk. If David finds out what we're doing, he'll come after both of us. He's not the kind of man who forgives betrayal." Mary leaned back, clutching the folder tightly. "If we don't act, he'll move Bill and bury the truth. This is our only chance." The two women exchanged a look of understanding. For the first time, Sophia seemed less like the aloof sister Mary had met weeks ago and more like an ally willing to stand up for her brother. "I'll back you up," Sophia said. "Whatever it takes." Later that day, Mary returned to the hospital, the weight of their plan heavy on her shoulders. As she entered Bill's room, a sharp voice stopped her in her tracks. "Quite the busy nurse, aren't you?" David's voice was cold, his figure looming in the corner of the room. Mary's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to appear calm. "Just doing my job, Mr. Harris." David stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Your job seems to involve more than just patient care. I wonder what the administration would think if they knew about your extracurricular activities. Mary's pulse quickened. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, David replied, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. Stay out of matters that don't concern you, Nurse Thompson, or you might find yourself looking for a new career. As David left, his threat hung in the air, but Mary's resolve only strengthened. She wouldn't let him intimidate her into silence. That evening, as Mary and Sophia discussed their next steps in the hospital's lounge, a nurse burst in, her face pale. Mary, it's Mr. Carter. Something's happening. Rushing to room 312, Mary's heart pounded. Inside, Bill's body was tense, his fingers twitching erratically, and his eyes fluttering as though he were struggling to open them. The monitors beeped wildly, signaling heightened activity. Bill? Mary whispered, stepping closer, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Can you hear me? Sophia gasped, tears welling in her eyes as she clutched Mary's arm. Is he? Mary leaned over him, her hand gently resting on his. For a moment, it felt as if he was trying to squeeze back, a faint pressure against her palm. Stay with us, Bill, she murmured. We're fighting for you. The activity slowed, but the faint signs of life remained. Mary turned to Sophia, her voice trembling. He's trying. He's still in there. Sophia nodded, her tears falling freely. Then we have to make sure he has a world to wake up to. The stakes were higher than ever, and now there was no turning back. David's power was crumbling, and Bill's silent fight gave them the strength to keep going. Mary sat at the edge of her small kitchen table, the documents from Sophia spread out before her. Each page felt heavier than the last. The evidence against David was damning, but the implications were far-reaching. If she exposed him, Carter Industries would face public scrutiny, and the fallout could devastate the Carter family's legacy. Yet doing nothing was unthinkable. Bill's life, and the truth, depended on her making the right choice. A knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Janet, her face tense but resolute. We need to talk, Janet said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Mary gestured for her to sit, and Janet wasted no time. David is planning something big, she said. I overheard him talking to the hospital administrator again. He's pushing hard to get Bill moved. But there's more. He mentioned adjusting Bill's care. Mary froze. Adjusting? What does that mean? Janet swallowed hard, her expression grim. I don't know, but it sounded like a threat. Whatever he's planning, it's happening soon. Mary's mind raced. She had enough evidence to stop David, but if she acted rashly, the repercussions could spiral out of control. I can't let him win, Janet, she said, but I need to be careful. If I go public, it might destroy what's left of the Carter family. Janet placed a hand on Mary's. Then we do this strategically. We protect Bill first and make sure David can't touch him. How? Mary asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Janet's eyes hardened. We secure his care. I know people in the hospital who can help. We'll make sure he's safe, no matter what David tries to pull. The following day, Mary and Janet worked quietly but efficiently. With Janet's connections, they arranged for extra monitoring on Bill's equipment, ensuring no unauthorized changes could be made without immediate alerts. Mary felt a flicker of hope, small but growing. That hope was shattered later that evening. Mary had just finished a round of checks on Bill's vitals when an alarm blared from his ventilator. She rushed to the machine, her hands flying to the controls. The settings had been altered, the oxygen levels dangerously low. Her heart pounded as she worked to stabilize him, calling for help from nearby staff. As the alarms quieted and Bill's condition steadied, Mary's gaze fell on the panel. The changes hadn't been accidental. Someone had sabotaged the machine. David. The realization hit her like a freight train. He wasn't just trying to cover his tracks. He was willing to risk Bill's life to do it. Sophia arrived moments later, her face pale with panic. What happened? She asked, her voice shaking. David, Mary said, her voice cold with fury. He's behind this. He's desperate, and he's not going to stop until Bill is out of the way. Sophia clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. Then we stop him now. No more waiting, no more doubts. Mary nodded, the weight of her decision finally lifting. They couldn't protect the Carter name if it meant sacrificing Bill's life. It was time to bring David down, whatever the cost. Mary stood in the stark, fluorescent-lit hospital hallway, her heart pounding as she clutched the folder of evidence tightly in her hands. Beside her, Sophia fidgeted, her usual composure frayed. The moment they had been preparing for was here. David was inside the hospital conference room, oblivious to what was coming. "I hope you're ready for this," Sophia said, her voice low but steady. Mary nodded, determination hardening her features. "He's done enough damage. It's time he faces the consequences." Together, they pushed open the door. David looked up from his seat at the head of the table, his expression shifting from mild irritation to veiled contempt. "Well, this is an unexpected visit," he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Sophia was the first to speak. "We know what you've been doing, David. The fraud, the manipulation, putting Bill in that coma. It ends now." David's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, his voice dripping with false amusement. "I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about." Mary stepped forward, slamming the folder onto the table. "Don't bother denying it. We have the proof. Financial records, emails, even notes about the drugs you used to keep Bill in this state." David's eyes flicked to the folder, a flash of unease breaking through his polished exterior. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, his tone darkening. "Accusations like these can ruin lives. Yours included. That's rich coming from you." Mary shot back, her voice shaking with fury. "You've already destroyed Bill's life. You stole from him, silenced him, and left him to die just so you could line your pockets. But he's still here, David. He's still fighting, and so are we." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, David's mask slipped, revealing the calculating man beneath. "You think you can take me down with this?" he sneered, gesturing at the folder. "Good luck. I've spent years building this empire. People like you don't stand a chance." Sophia stepped closer, her voice cutting through his bravado. "You underestimated us, David, and you underestimated Bill. He's not as helpless as you think." As if on cue, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A nurse rushed in, breathless. "Mr. Carter, he's waking up." The words hit like a lightning bolt. Mary and Sophia exchanged a stunned glance before bolting out of the room, leaving David frozen in his seat. Inside room 312, Bill lay with his eyes half open, his chest rising and falling unevenly as he struggled to regain consciousness. Mary rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she grasped his. "Bill," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me, Mary. You're safe." Bill's lips moved faintly, forming words that were barely audible. "Danger. David. Accident." Sophia leaned over him, her face pale. "Bill, what are you saying? Did David?" Bill nodded weakly, his gaze locking onto his sister's. "Planned everything," he rasped. "Didn't see brakes cut." Mary's heart shattered at his words, the weight of his struggle evident in every strained breath. She turned to Sophia, her voice firm. "This is it. This is the confirmation we need." Sophia nodded, wiping her tears. "He's finally telling the truth. We can't let David get away with this." Just as they began to process the gravity of Bill's words, the door swung open violently. David stood there, his face twisted with rage. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, stepping into the room. Mary positioned herself between Bill and David, her voice unwavering. "It's over, David. Bill knows what you did. He remembers." David's eyes darted to Bill, whose feeble nod confirmed his worst fears. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice desperate now. "If you expose me, you'll destroy everything. This company, the family, everything Bill built." Sophia stepped forward, her voice like steel. "You already destroyed it, David. We're just cleaning up your mess." For the first time, David seemed to falter, the weight of his crimes bearing down on him. He looked at Mary, his voice hollow. "You'll regret this." Mary met his gaze, unflinching. The only regret I have is not stopping you sooner. David's shoulders sagged as security entered the room, summoned by the nurse. They escorted him out, his threats fading into the distance. In the silence that followed, Mary turned back to Bill, her heart swelling with both relief and sorrow. "You're safe now," she whispered, brushing a hand gently over his. "It's over." Bill's lips curved into the faintest smile, his grip tightening ever so slightly around her fingers. In that moment, the fight was won. But Mary knew their journey was far from over. Bill sat propped up in the hospital bed, his breathing labored but steady. His frail appearance belied the resolve in his eyes as he glanced around the room. Sophia stood near the window, visibly torn, while Mary sat beside him, a notebook in hand, ready to document every word. "You don't have to do this now," Mary said softly, her voice tinged with concern. Bill shook his head weakly. "I've waited too long already," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, each word a struggle, but his determination shone through. "David, he's taken enough from me." Mary nodded, squeezing his hand for reassurance. "Take your time," she urged. "Start from the beginning." Bill closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he opened them, he began to speak, his voice trembling but clear. "The accident wasn't an accident. David had been making moves against me for months. I started noticing discrepancies in the company's finances, small at first, but they didn't add up." Sophia took a hesitant step forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice laced with guilt. "I didn't know who I could trust," Bill admitted, his gaze softening as it landed on his sister. "David was careful, manipulating people, creating chaos. By the time I realized how deep it went, it was too late." He paused, catching his breath. Mary leaned in, encouraging him to continue. "The night of the accident," he said, his tone heavy with emotion, "I was on my way to confront him. I had evidence, emails, transfers, everything, but I never made it. The brakes, they didn't respond." Sophia's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Bill, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." "I believe you," he replied, his voice soft but sincere. "But now, we have to fix this. Together." The following day, Mary walked into the hospital's administrative office, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She had spent the night compiling every piece of evidence they had: Bill's testimony, Sophia's documents, and the findings she and Alex had uncovered. As she handed it to the legal team, she felt a pang of fear. This could cost her everything. "You understand the risks of involving yourself to this degree?" one of the administrators asked, glancing over the documents. Mary nodded. "I understand, but Bill deserves justice. This has to stop." The hours that followed were a blur. Statements were taken, calls were made, and soon, law enforcement was involved. By the afternoon, David was escorted out of the hospital in handcuffs, his facade of control shattered. As he passed Mary, he shot her a glare filled with venom, but she held her ground, unflinching. That evening, Mary returned to Bill's room, exhaustion etched into her features. Sophia was already there, sitting quietly by her brother's side. The atmosphere was heavy, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. "You did it," Sophia said, her voice low but steady. "You stopped him." Mary shook her head. "We did it. All of us." Sophia hesitated, then spoke again. "But now, I have to face my own part in this. I hesitated when I should have acted. I let my fear control me, and because of that, Bill suffered." Bill reached out weakly, his hand trembling as it found Sophia's. "You're here now," he said, his voice thin but firm. "That's what matters. We'll fix this together." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she nodded, her brother's forgiveness a balm to her guilt. As the night wore on, Mary sat by Bill's bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. Her own sacrifices weighed heavily on her. She knew her job might be in jeopardy for stepping so far beyond her professional boundaries. But as she looked at Bill, alive and fighting, she knew it had been worth it. "Thank you," Bill murmured, his eyes meeting hers. "For what?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For not giving up," he replied. "On me, on the truth." On everything, Mary smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. You gave me something to fight for, she said. I just returned the favor. As the room fell into a peaceful silence, the echoes of their shared struggle lingered. Justice had been served, but the road ahead remained uncertain, filled with both challenges and hope. The sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds of room 312, casting a soft glow across the room. Bill, sitting upright for the first time in weeks, looked out the window, his gaze lingering on the bustling world beyond. Mary sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair, unsure of how to break the peaceful silence. Feels strange, Bill said finally, his voice still weak but steadier than it had been. To be here, alive, after everything. Mary smiled faintly, her eyes warm as she met his gaze. You fought for this, and you had a lot of people fighting for you. Bill turned to her, his expression softening. Not just people. You. I don't think I'd still be here if it weren't for you. Mary shook her head, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. You're giving me too much credit. You were the one fighting, Bill. I just made sure you had a chance. Bill's lips quirked into a small smile, one filled with gratitude and something deeper. I've had a lot of time to think, too much time, really. And I realized that before the accident, I was distant, detached from the things that should have mattered most. I thought money and success were enough, but I see now that I lost sight of what's important. Mary's throat tightened as his words hit home. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. It's never too late to make things right, she said gently. You've been given a second chance, Bill. Not many people get that. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. And I don't want to waste it. But I can't do this alone. Mary, I've seen what kind of person you are. Your strength, your compassion. You see people, even when the world doesn't. I need someone like that in my corner. Mary's breath hitched at the sincerity in his voice. Are you asking me to stay? She asked softly. Yes, he said, his tone firm despite his weakened state. Not just as my nurse, but as someone who believes in the same things I want to fight for now. I want to use what I have to help people like you, like the ones you've talked about, vulnerable people who need someone to stand up for them. Tears pricked at Mary's eyes, but she blinked them away, a slow smile spreading across her face. That's an incredible idea, Bill. And if you're serious, I'd be honored to help. Bill's smile widened, and for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope, real hope. Then let's make it happen. Together. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Bill worked with Sophia and Mary to unravel the damage David had done, restoring trust within Carter Industries and setting new priorities for the company. For Mary, it was a crash course in a world she'd never imagined being part of, but one she embraced with her characteristic determination. One evening, as they sat in Bill's study reviewing plans for a new initiative, he leaned back and regarded her thoughtfully. You know, he began, I've always believed in giving back, but it wasn't until I met you that I understood what it really means. Mary looked up from the stack of papers, curiosity in her eyes. What do you mean? You've spent your whole life helping others, even when you didn't have much yourself, he said. You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of impact I want to have now. Her heart swelled at his words, but she shrugged lightly, trying to downplay her role. I just did what I could. And it made all the difference, he said firmly. You showed me that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple out and change lives. That's what I want this new chapter to be about. Mary smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. Then let's do it. Let's build something that really matters. As they delved back into their plans, the bond between them deepened, built on shared values and a mutual respect that had grown through the trials they had faced. For the first time in a long while, Mary felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Later that night, as Mary prepared to leave, Bill stopped her at the door. Mary, he said, his voice soft but earnest. Thank you for everything. She turned to him, her smile warm. You don't need to thank me, Bill. I'm just glad you're here. And I'm glad you stayed, he replied, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, the connection between them felt unshakable, a promise of a future built together. As Mary walked down the quiet hallway, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. They had come so far, and there was still so much to do. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. Sophia Carter sat at the long oak table in the Carter estate's study, the light from the grand chandelier above casting a soft glow on the stack of papers before her. The documents represented a decision she had been grappling with for weeks, but as she picked up the pen, her hand no longer trembled. She signed her name with conviction, sealing her promise. Across the table, Mary watched quietly, admiration and surprise in her eyes. "You're sure about this?" she asked softly. Sophia looked up, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "Absolutely. It's the least I can do. For Bill, for the people he cared about, and for myself." The papers outlined Sophia's donation of her share of the Carter family inheritance, a significant fortune, to various community projects, housing initiatives, education programs, and shelters for vulnerable families were at the top of the list. It was her way of atoning for her silence and complicity during David's schemes. "I spent so much of my life running from responsibility," Sophia admitted, leaning back in her chair. "I thought money and distance could protect me, but all it did was isolate me. I have a chance to make things right now, and I'm not wasting it." Mary nodded, her respect for Sophia deepening. "This will help so many people. Bill would be proud." Later that day, Mary found herself in a quiet corner of the hospital garden, the soft hum of the world around her a welcome reprieve from the whirlwind of recent events. She had come here to think, to untangle the knots of uncertainty that still lingered in her mind. For years, Mary had dedicated herself to helping others, often at the expense of her own dreams. Her past in the foster system had shaped her, driven her to be a nurse, and pushed her to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But now, with Bill's recovery and the unraveling of David's schemes, she found herself asking a question she had long avoided. What did she truly want for herself? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. She turned to see Bill, walking slowly but steadily toward her, a cane in hand for support. His recovery was ongoing, but each step he took was a testament to his resilience. "You look deep in thought," he said, his voice warm as he joined her on the bench. Mary smiled faintly, "Just trying to figure out where to go from here." Bill studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've done so much for me, Mary, for my family, for the truth, but you've also given a lot of yourself. Maybe it's time you think about what you want." Mary hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. "I want to keep helping people," she said finally, "but I also want to do more. To create something lasting, something that can reach the people who need it most." Bill's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hand. "Then let's do it together." Mary looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about everything we've been through," Bill said. "Everything you've done to fight for me, for justice. I want to honor that. I want to create a foundation, a project that focuses on helping vulnerable people, those who've been overlooked or forgotten. And I want you to lead it." Mary's breath caught, her eyes widening. "Bill, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied with a small smile. "You have the passion, the drive, and the experience. You know what it's like to be in their shoes. You're exactly the person this project needs." Tears pricked at Mary's eyes as the enormity of his offer sank in. It wasn't just a chance to make a difference. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had worked for, everything she had endured. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this," she admitted. "You're more than ready," Bill said, his voice steady and reassuring. "And you won't be doing it alone. We'll build this together, in memory of the fight we shared." Mary wiped at her eyes, a smile breaking through her hesitation. "Then yes," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." In the weeks that followed, plans for the Carter Foundation began to take shape. Mary and Bill worked tirelessly, crafting initiatives focused on housing, education, and healthcare for those in need. Sophia joined them, her donation serving as the foundation's first major investment. For Mary, the work was more than a job. It was a calling, a way to channel her past struggles into something meaningful. And for Bill, It was a chance to rebuild his legacy, not with wealth or power, but with compassion and purpose. One evening, as they reviewed plans for their first outreach program, Bill turned to Mary with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "this isn't just about helping others. It's about hope. For all of us." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "Then let's make sure it's a hope worth fighting for." As the night deepened, the two of them sat side by side, their shared vision lighting the path forward. It was a new beginning, not just for the Carter family, but for everyone they hoped to help along the way. The Carter Foundation's inaugural event was held on a bright spring morning, the crisp air carrying the hum of excitement. The sprawling venue brimmed with people, community leaders, beneficiaries, and volunteers, all gathered to celebrate the launch of a mission born from struggle and hope. Bill, dressed sharply but leaning lightly on his cane, stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile. Mary moved through the crowd with ease, her clipboard in hand as she oversaw the day's proceedings. She paused to watch a group of children playing near a booth that showcased the Foundation's first project, a shelter for families facing housing instability. Their laughter was a reminder of why they were there. "Looks like it's going well," Bill said, stepping up beside her. Mary turned, her smile mirroring his. "Better than I could have imagined." Bill glanced at the booth and the families gathered around it. "This wouldn't have been possible without you," he said, his voice sincere. "You've turned what started as a fight for survival into something extraordinary." Mary shook her head, her expression soft. "It wasn't just me, Bill. We all played a part. Sophia, the people who believed in us, and you. You fought your way back to this moment." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I had someone to fight for." As the day progressed, Mary found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The dark days of uncertainty and fear felt like a distant memory now, replaced by purpose and fulfillment. Yet, the lessons of that time lingered, shaping her perspective. She wandered to a quiet corner of the venue, finding a bench shaded by a blooming tree. Sitting down, she let the sounds of the event fade into the background. Her thoughts drifted to the beginning, to the sterile hospital room where Bill had been just a silent figure, and she, a nurse battling her own insecurities. The smallest choices had led her here, choosing to listen when no one else did, choosing to believe in him when it would have been easier to walk away. Those moments of courage, born from instinct rather than certainty, had changed not only her life but the lives of countless others. Bill joined her after a while, settling on the bench with a contented sigh. "Taking a moment for yourself?" he asked. "Just thinking," she replied, "about how far we've come, about how something so small, like noticing your hand tapping, could lead to all this." Bill smiled faintly, his gaze thoughtful. "It's funny, isn't it? How the quietest moments can carry the loudest messages." Mary nodded, her heart full. "It's true. Sometimes, the silence can say more than words ever could." They sat together in companionable quiet, the weight of their shared past now a foundation for the future. Around them, the event carried on, the laughter of children and the hum of conversation painting a picture of hope fulfilled. For Mary, the path ahead was clear. The Carter Foundation wasn't just a job, it was a legacy, and it was proof that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple out and change the world. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the crowd, she turned to Bill, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We're just getting started." He smiled, his eyes reflecting the same determination. "And it's going to be worth every step." Together, they rose, stepping back into the heart of the event. Ready to continue the work they had begun, the Carter Foundation's inaugural event was held on a bright spring morning, the crisp air carrying the hum of excitement. The sprawling venue brimmed with people, community leaders, beneficiaries, and volunteers, all gathered to celebrate the launch of a mission born from struggle and hope. Bill, dressed sharply but leaning lightly on his cane, stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile. Mary moved through the crowd with ease, her clipboard in hand as she oversaw the day's proceedings. She paused to watch a group of children playing near a booth that showcased the Foundation's first project, a shelter for families facing housing instability. Their laughter was a reminder of why they were there. "Looks like it's going well," Bill said, stepping up beside her. Mary turned, her smile mirroring his. "Better than I could have imagined." Bill glanced at the booth and the families gathered around it. "This wouldn't have been possible without you," he said, his voice sincere. "You've turned what started as a fight for survival into something extraordinary." Mary shook her head, her expression soft. "It wasn't just me, Bill. We all played a part. Sophia, the people who believed in us, and you. You fought your way back to this moment." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I had someone to fight for." As the day progressed, Mary found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The dark days of uncertainty and fear felt like a distant memory now, replaced by purpose and fulfillment. Yet, the lessons of that time lingered, shaping her perspective. She wandered to a quiet corner of the venue, finding a bench shaded by a blooming tree. Sitting down, she let the sounds of the event fade into the background. Her thoughts drifted to the beginning, to the sterile hospital room where Bill had been just a silent figure, and she, a nurse battling her own insecurities. The smallest choices had led her here, choosing to listen when no one else did, choosing to believe in him when it would have been easier to walk away. Those moments of courage, born from instinct rather than certainty, had changed not only her life but the lives of countless others. Bill joined her after a while, settling on the bench with a contented sigh. "Taking a moment for yourself?" he asked. "Just thinking," she replied, "about how far we've come, about how something so small, like noticing your hand tapping, could lead to all this." Bill smiled faintly, his gaze thoughtful. "It's funny, isn't it? How the quietest moments can carry the loudest messages." Mary nodded, her heart full. "It's true. Sometimes, the silence can say more than words ever could." They sat together in companionable quiet, the weight of their shared past now a foundation for the future. Around them, the event carried on, the laughter of children and the hum of conversation painting a picture of hope fulfilled. For Mary, the path ahead was clear. The Carter Foundation wasn't just a job, it was a legacy, and it was proof that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple out and change the world. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the crowd, she turned to Bill, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We're just getting started." He smiled, his eyes reflecting the same determination. "And it's going to be worth every step." Together, they rose, stepping back into the heart of the event, ready to continue the work they had begun. Have you ever stopped to think about the impact your small gestures can have on someone's life? If this story has touched your heart, be sure to check out the next videos on our channel. We have more incredible content waiting for you. Don't miss out.